The TreeHouse Adventures, written by John Carcello and Mallory Page. Chapter 2, Stand Tall. The following day, everyone was asleep in the treehouse except for Annalisa, who had awakened early and went out on the balcony to see if they had been teleported back home.
Guys?
Annalisa said nervously.
Be quiet, Annalisa. Some of us are trying to sleep.
Richard snapped.
Yeah, I need my beauty sleep if I want Jake to be jealous.
Jasmine added.
Well, unless Jake is from Bible times and older than he says, you probably won't be seeing him,
Replied Annalisa. Jasmine scrambled to the window with the other kids, gasping loudly as she realized they were once again in ancient Palestine.
No! Quick, pray Emily gets gum stuck in her hair so she has to chop it all off so Jake won't pick her over me.
Jasmine cried desperately.
Maybe we should pray that happens to you so you can learn to be humble.
Richard replied. Jasmine gasped dramatically.
Take that back!
She insisted.
I think we have bigger problems than Jake right now.
Jaylee interrupted.
Yeah, like the fact that we're stuck in the Bible.
Annalisa scoffed.
Okay, geez, you didn't have to yell.
Richard replied.
Nothing gets through that thick skull of yours otherwise.
Annalisa replied.
Guys, what are we going to do?
Asked Jaylee.
Okay, hold on, let me think.
Replied Richard. After a short pause, Jasmine suggested.
What if this is like a video game?
What do you mean?
Asked Jaylee. Jasmine continued.
What if, to get back home, we have to complete a task and win the game to get back home? Maybe we are meant to learn something while we're here.
Actually, not a bad thought.
Annalisa said, surprised that Jasmine could come up with such a bright idea.
What? I can be smart when I want something, and I want to get back home to Jake before it's too late.
Jasmine replied.
Okay, well, I guess the only thing to do is go find Jesus again. But from what I see, we aren't in the same place we were last night. It's like the treehouse moved.
Jaylee said.
How are we supposed to find Jesus?
Asked Richard.
That might be easier than you think.
Replied Annalisa.
Look.
Annalisa pointed towards a building not too far away with a huge crowd surrounding it.
Follow the crowd. Not a bad idea.
Jaylee replied.
Well, what are we waiting for? We have to go find Jesus.
Replied Jasmine.
Yeah, we know what you meant.
Richard replied. The kids headed out of the treehouse and made their way to the house that had the crowd outside of it. As they tried to get closer to the house, they looked over and saw 4 men carrying another man who was paralyzed. They watched as the men were unable to get the paralyzed man into the house, so they made their way up to the roof.
What are they doing?
Jaylee asked curiously.
I'm not sure.
Replied Annalisa.
Hey, this way!
Instructed Richard. Richard guided them closer to a low window where they could see Jesus preaching to the crowd.
Do you think he'll notice us again?
Jasmine asked, looking towards Jesus. Just then, Jesus looked over at the kids through the window with a knowing smile.
Well, that answered your question.
Richard replied. Suddenly, dust began falling from the ceiling as everyone inside looked up, astonished at what they were witnessing. 4 men were sawing a hole in the roof so they could lower a paralyzed man down to Jesus.
Look, it's those men we saw earlier.
Annalisa cried.
Is that the guy they were carrying earlier? It looks like they're lowering him from the roof.
Said Jasmine.
Of course, I know this story.
Replied Jaylee. Everyone stared in awe as Jesus knelt down and said to the paralyzed man,
Son, your sins are forgiven. I tell you, get up. Take your mat and go home.
Jesus said. The whole crowd gasped as they witnessed the once paralyzed man stand up, pick up his mat, and walk. The crowd parted as the once paralyzed man walked by, singing praises to God. The kids were equally astonished at what just took place.
Did that man just stand up and start walking?
Jasmine asked in disbelief.
I think so.
Replied a bewildered Annalisa.
That's amazing.
Remarked Jaylee.
Guys?
Richard interrupted. The kids looked back to the window to find Jesus leaning over it with a knowing smile.
I'm glad to see you've returned.
Jesus said, still smiling.
I still can't believe it's really you,
replied Jaylee.
What you just did was totally awesome.
Jasmine chirped.
Tell me, what did you observe today, my children?
Jesus asked jovially.
I noticed that before you healed his body, you told him your sins are forgiven. Why did you say that before healing him?
Asked Annalisa.
Sometimes it's the illness you can't see that causes the illness you can see.
Jesus replied. Assuming Jesus was implying that's why she was in a wheelchair, Jaylee was sad and said,
Oh, so that's why I'm...
Jesus interrupted Jaylee.
And other times, God chooses special vessels to display his power through their weakness, Jaylee.
Jaylee looked up at Jesus, hopeful. As tears filled her eyes, Jesus continued,
I remember making you. That was a beautiful day.
Jaylee gasped, realizing what Jesus was saying, but before she could respond, Jesus smiled and disappeared. Annalisa approached Jaylee, having witnessed the exchange between her and Jesus, and wanting to make sure she was okay, asked,
Jaylee, are you okay?
Jaylee just smiled and replied,
I've never been better.
Well, I have, and if I don't get something to eat soon, you're gonna see cranky Richard come out.
Richard replied, again ending a nice moment.
Isn't that the Richard we see all the time?
Jasmine quipped.
Oh, be quiet, Jasmania. All you care about is Jake. Why don't you try reading a book sometime?
Richard scolded.
I'd rather write one.
Yelled Jasmine.
Yeah, that would be a bestseller, let me tell you. Dear Jake, I love you forever. The end.
Sneered Richard.
Oh, yeah? It would be better than your book. Hey, everybody, I'm Richard. My life is terrible. The end.
Jasmine shot back.
Oh, yeah? Well.
Richard began, but was interrupted by Jaylee, who had clearly had enough of their bickering.
Ugh, I've heard enough.
Jaylee scolded.
He started it.
Jasmine pleaded.
No, I didn't.
Richard said defensively.
Guys, seriously, stop. Don't you get it? You're both so busy arguing about writing books that you can't see that we are actually in one.
Said Jaylee.
A notebook?
Jasmine asked.
Aye, aye, aye.
Annalisa remarked.
No, Jasmine, the book we are in is far better than some romance novel. We are in the Gospel of Mark.
Jaylee replied.
Does Mark have any fast food restaurants in it?
A hangry Richard asked.
Not quite.
Replied Jaylee.
I'm sorry, are we just gonna go on and pretend that we didn't just witness Jesus talk to Jaylee and then disappear into thin air?
Annalisa asked, clearly exasperated.
That was pretty cool.
Richard replied.
That was amazing.
Added Jaylee.
Can we go to the part of the story where Jesus feeds the 5,000?
Asked Richard.
I'd rather see Jesus raise the dead.
Snapped Annalisa.
I was being sarcastic. I'm hungry.
Richard replied.
I know, I was too. Your breath made me do it.
Annalisa replied, implying Richard's breath smelled like decay.
Would everyone please stop arguing? We just witnessed a miracle and all you want to do is complain. Richard, do you think I'm not hungry? Do you wish your breath smells any better, Annalisa? I'm hungry and I really wish I had a toothbrush, but who cares? We are getting to witness firsthand what others will only ever hear about. Does that mean nothing to you?
Cried Jaylee. Richard and Annalisa realized Jaylee was right and apologized to each other.
Sorry.
Said Richard.
Sorry.
Annalisa replied.
That's better.
Jaylee said.
Oh, no!
Cried Jasmine, startling the other kids.
What? What happened?
Asked an unnerved Jaylee.
My phone just died.
Jasmine replied.
Ugh, I'm going back to the treehouse.
Annalisa said, annoyed by Jasmine's petulance and tendency to be overly dramatic.
Race you there.
Richard said.
Richard, if you raised my Aunt Charlotte, who was 8 months pregnant, you'd come in third.
Annalisa jabbed. Richard and Annalisa began racing. Realizing this, Jasmine called out.
Guys, wait for me. I'm too cute and fragile to be out here alone. Jaylee, you coming?
You guys go ahead. I'll catch up with you in a little while. I just want to savor what happened for a while.
Jaylee said somberly, and she watched them race away.
Not like I could keep up with them anyway.
She mumbled, unaware that Jesus had reappeared behind her.
It's not all bad,
Jesus said, surprising Jaylee.
Jesus, you're back.
Jaylee exclaimed ecstatically. Jesus smiled and replied.
I have a thing about coming after the one who gets left behind.
Jaylee smiled as tears again filled her eyes.
How about a hug?
Jesus asked while holding out his arms.
Yes, please.
Jaylee replied, reaching up from her wheelchair.
Okay, but you have to come to me.
Jesus replied. Unaware of how that could be possible, Jaylee said,
But I'm...
My child.
Jesus said, not letting Jaylee finish her sentence. Jaylee was amazed to feel strength enter her legs for the first time, and even more amazed when she stood up. Taking her by the hands, Jesus said,
That's it.
I can't believe it. I'm actually standing?
Jaylee exclaimed. Meanwhile, Annalisa's voice could be heard at a distance.
Jaylee!
Annalisa called out, trying to locate Jaylee. Jaylee looked over her shoulder and then back at Jesus.
Uh-oh, it looks like I'm not the only one who come back for you. You better get back to the treehouse. They need you,
said Jesus, lowering Jaylee back into her chair.
But I can't keep standing?
Asked Jaylee.
Jaylee, you've stood taller than most of those around you all your life. But I promise you, this won't be the last time you run to see me. And the next time you run to me, you will never need your chair again. Now off you go, kiddo,
Jesus replied. Jaylee cried happy tears as Jesus disappeared and turned around to see Annalisa.
Whew, there you are. Sorry, I shouldn't have left you alone, but I had to put Richard in his place.
A relieved Annalisa remarked.
It's okay. I wasn't alone.
Jaylee replied, smiling.
Well, we better get back to the treehouse. Richard found Jasmine's diary and secret stash of snacks. She grabbed her snacks before he could eat them, but now he's holding her diary ransom until she gives them back.
Annalisa said.
Those two.
Sighed Jaylee.
Tell me about it. They bigger more than Harry and Big Jim. Speaking of Harry and Big Jim, I wonder what they're doing now.
Asked Annalisa. The two of them headed back to the treehouse.